the morning the buses came. At 8:17 on a Saturday morning in August of 1995, 6 yellow school buses came grinding up the gravel road toward my orchard, and by 8:25 there were close to 300 strangers pouring onto land my late husband and I had spent 27 years trying to keep quiet. By 8:30, a man named Darrell Price was standing beside my spring-fed pond with a bullhorn in one hand, a folded map in the other, telling everybody there that the place belonged to them now. I was 54 years old, widowed for 6 years, and I had learned that grief can make a person soft in places they never expected, but it can also teach you what you are willing to protect when there is nobody left to protect it with you. My name is May Klein, and back then I lived just outside Bracken Hollow, Pennsylvania, on 12 acres my husband Eli and I bought before the new subdivision, before the fancy brick entrance sign, before people started calling a patch of woods a community lifestyle. We had an old apple orchard, a red barn that leaned a little to the left, a pond fed by a cold spring, and enough peace to hear the train whistle from town when the wind was coming from the east. Eli used to say the pond was the heart of the place. He would stand there in his old work boots, hands on his hips, watching the light move across the water and say, "May, one day somebody is going to want this more than we do, and that is exactly why we ought to hold on to it." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. After he died, I understood he had been warning me. The trouble started when Maple Ridge Estates went up across the county road, first with 12 houses, then 20, then more little beige houses with 2 car garages and lawns so green they looked painted. Darrell Price was the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, although he liked to call himself a community builder, which was a fancy way of saying he sold dreams to people and then expected everyone else to make good on them. He was in his early 40s, always wearing a golf shirt tucked too tightly into khaki pants, always smelling faintly of aftershave and cigarette smoke, always carrying a leather portfolio, even if he was only walking from his Buick to the mailbox. He had a smile that made you feel like you had been invited into a room where everybody was already talking about you. At first, he came by polite as pie. He said he loved the old orchard. He said the pond would make a lovely shared recreation area. He said the new families had children, and children needed places to fish and run around, and had I ever considered being part of something bigger than myself? I told him no. I did not slam the door. I did not throw a glass of lemonade in his face. I simply told him no, thank you. This land was not for sale, not for lease, and not for the use of anybody who had not been invited. He smiled and said, "Well, Mrs. Klein, sometimes the future has a way of making decisions for us." I remember standing there after he drove away, looking at the dust settle behind his Buick, and thinking that line had more teeth in it than he meant for me to hear. After that, the letters began. One said my barn was an eyesore visible from Maple Ridge. One said my old pickup truck near the fence line was lowering property values. One said my goats were a nuisance. Even though I did not own goats, I owned 2 barn cats and a tired old beagle named Roscoe, who had been asleep through every alleged disturbance in the county. Then came the claim that an old drainage easement along the roadside gave the HOA rights to enter my property for community maintenance. Barrel sent those letters on official-looking stationery, with a gold seal at the top, on words like compliance, environmental concern, and neighborhood standards. I kept every one of them in a cardboard file box beneath the kitchen table. I did not know it at the time, but that box would become more useful than a shotgun and a whole lot safer. The first time I realized Darrell was not just bluffing was in late July, when I stopped at the IGA for coffee and saw a stack of glossy flyers near the register. They showed a drawing of children fishing, families grilling hamburgers, balloons tied to picnic tables, all beside a bright blue pond that looked an awful lot like mine. Across the top it said Maple Ridge Family Heritage Day. At the bottom, in small cheerful letters, it said hosted at our community lake and greenbelt. I stood there with my coffee halfway to my mouth, staring at that little blue pond, and I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. I took one of the flyers, brought it home, laid it beside my property survey, and called the county planning office. The woman who answered was named Donna Wells. She had known Eli from church and knew me well enough to say, "May, honey, why are you asking me about Maple Ridge?" I told her what was on the flyer. There was a long silence on the other end. Then I heard paper shuffling. She said, "That pond is not theirs. Never was. They do not have a park permit. They do not have a lease, and they sure as hell do not have the deed." I asked her what I should do. She told me to call Sheriff Halverson, document everything, and do not let Daryl bait me into making the first bad move. So that is what I did. I called Sheriff Halverson, who had been sheriff since Ronald Reagan was still in office and looked like he had been carved out of an old fence post. I told him I had reason to believe Daryl Price was planning to bring people onto my land without permission. He let out a long breath and said, "May, I have been hearing things. Keep your doors locked. Keep your paperwork close. Call me the second you see a bus, truck, or marching band coming up that road." I laughed at the marching band part because I thought he was joking. Looking back, I am not entirely sure he was. The week before Heritage Day, I had the old cattle gate reinforced. It was a heavy steel thing Eli had installed years earlier, after a neighbor's cows kept wandering into our orchard, and it stretched across the only driveway wide enough for buses or trucks. I added a new chain, a commercial padlock, and a second latch on the inside. Nothing fancy, no remote control, no movie trick, just steel, bolts, and common sense. I also bought a used VHS camcorder from a pawn shop in town, the kind that sat on your shoulder and made you look like you worked for Channel 6 News. My nephew Tommy came over and showed me how to work it. He said, "Aunt May, just point it at Daryl and hit record. The man will do the rest." That was the closest thing to legal advice I got that summer, and frankly, it was not bad advice. The morning of the event began almost sweetly. The air was cool, the kind of Pennsylvania morning that carries the smell of wet grass and apples before the heat comes in. Roscoe was asleep beneath the porch swing, and I was sitting in my robe with a cup of Folgers when I heard the first engine. At first I thought it was a logging truck. Then I heard another one, then another. The sound grew heavier and deeper until the windows in the kitchen started to rattle. I stepped onto the porch and looked past the orchard. There they were, 6 school buses rolling up my gravel drive in a crooked yellow line, followed by minivans, pickup trucks, and Daryl's dark green Buick at the front, like he was leading a parade. They stopped right inside the open gate. The bus doors folded open. Kids came out carrying tackle boxes and inflatable rafts. Parents came out hauling coolers, folding chairs, paper plates, cheap charcoal grills, and plastic bags full of hamburger buns. A few teenagers dragged a portable stereo across the grass. One man had a softball bat over his shoulder. Somebody had brought a pony keg, which told me Daryl's idea of family heritage had apparently taken a sharp left turn somewhere near the beer distributor. Then I saw the banner. It was tied between 2 of my apple trees. Maple Ridge Community Late Day. Welcome home. I did not yell. I did not run. I stood on the porch holding my coffee, watching people claim pieces of my land without even realizing what they were doing. Some of them looked happy, some looked confused. One little girl in a pink swimsuit was skipping toward the pond, carrying a fishing pole taller than she was. That was the part that got to me, not the chairs or the grills or the banner. It was the children, because they had no idea they had been used as scenery in somebody else's little war. Daryl was near the pond, talking through his bullhorn. He had on a white polo shirt, tan shorts, deck shoes with no socks, and a smile so wide it looked painful. "Today," he said, "we celebrate what happens when a community stops letting one person stand in the way of progress." People clapped. Not everybody, but enough. Then he saw me. He raised the bullhorn toward the porch and said, "Mrs. Klein, thank you for finally recognizing that this land has a bigger purpose than one lonely old orchard." I will never forget that sentence. Lonely old orchard. As if Eli's hands had not planted those trees. As if every winter I had spent wrapping the trunks against frost. Every spring I had spent waiting for blossom. Every summer I had spent picking apples until my back gave out, meant less than whatever Daryl had printed in a brochure. I walked down from the porch slowly, wearing jeans, boots, and one of Eli's old denim shirts. I had the camcorder in one hand and the file box in the other. Daryl watched me come toward him with that smug little smile. "Well, May," he said, dropping the bullhorn to his side, "I was hoping you would join us." I looked past him at the pond, at the people setting up lawn chairs under trees I had planted, at a boy throwing a rock near the nesting place of a pair of ducks, and I said, "I am joining you, Daryl, just not the way you expected." Then I set the file box on the porch rail, lifted the camcorder, and pressed record. He laughed at first. "Oh, please, you are not going to scare anybody with that thing." "No," I said, looking straight at him through the viewfinder. "I am going to let you explain yourself to everybody else." Then I walked back to the gate. The last bus had come through. Every vehicle was now on my side of the property line. I pulled the gate shut, slid the steel bar into place, wrapped the chain through the latch twice, and clicked the padlock closed. The sound was not dramatic, not at first. Just metal settling against metal, chains scraping steel, a lock snapping shut. But people noticed. The nearest bus driver looked over. Then another. A few parents stopped unfolding chairs. Darrell stared at me like I had suddenly started speaking another language. "May," he said, his voice tightening, "what exactly do you think you are doing?" I turned around, still holding the camcorder, and said, loud enough for the first few rows of people to hear, "I am securing my private property until the sheriff arrives." The silence that followed was not a clean silence. It was the sort of silence full of little noises, coolers being set down, children asking questions, somebody's radio playing too loudly in the distance, and one of the bus engines coughing as it idled. Darrell came toward me fast. "You cannot keep people here." "I am not keeping anybody here," I told him. "The pedestrian gate by the mailbox is open, and the sheriff is already on his way. But those buses are not moving until somebody in uniform tells me they can." His face went red. "This is community land." "Then show me the paperwork," I said. He blinked. "What?" "Show me the deed, Darrell. Show me the permit. Show me the county easement that lets you bring 6 buses full of people into my orchard and call it yours." He looked around as if the answer might be written on one of the banners. Then he grabbed his portfolio from the hood of his Buick, opened it, and began flipping through papers. The sound of those pages turning was one of the sweetest sounds I had heard in a long time. Part 2. The Long Afternoon. Darrell kept talking, because men like Darrell always talk harder when the facts begin to leave the room. He said the subdivision had historical access rights. He said the old road was a shared route. He said the pond had been part of a conservation plan, which was nonsense because nobody in Bracken Hollow had ever used the word conservation plan unless they were trying to sell you something or get out of mowing a field. He said people had paid for this event, and he said it loud enough for the crowd to hear. That was when the first real change came over the people around us. A woman near the buses, maybe 40, maybe younger, holding a little boy by the hand, looked at Darrell and said, "Pay for what? You told us this was the neighborhood lake." Darrell kept smiling, but it had become a very expensive-looking smile. "It is the neighborhood lake," he said. "There are just some legal details being handled." The woman looked at me, then at the gate, then at the big private property sign that had been there for 20 years but apparently had become invisible whenever Darrell needed it to be. "You said this was settled," she told him. "It is settled," he snapped, and that was the first time his real voice came out. Not the polished voice he used at HOA meetings, not the cheerful voice in the brochures. Just anger. Pure, thin-skinned anger. A few people stepped back from him. I noticed one older man sitting on a folding chair near the edge of the orchard. His name was Walter Green, retired county surveyor, and he had been friends with Eli since they were boys. I had not known he was there. He stood up slowly, brushed grass from the back of his pants, and walked toward us. "Darrell," he said, "you know good and well that pond belongs to May." Darrell turned on him. "Walter, this does not concern you." Walter folded his arms. "It concerns me when you hand out maps with lines you drew yourself." Darrell pointed a finger at him. "You stay out of this." Walter smiled in the quiet way old men do when they know they have lived long enough to outlast somebody else's nonsense. "Son," he said, "I have been reading property lines since before you knew what a mortgage was. You have not got 1 inch of claim out here." The crowd heard that. They heard every word. It began with whispers, then questions, then that low, uneasy murmur people make when they realize they are standing in the middle of a story they would rather not be part of. A man with a red baseball cap walked up to one of the bus drivers and asked when they were leaving. The driver, a heavy-set fellow named Lou who had probably seen every kind of school field trip disaster known to man, said, "Buddy, I was told this was a permitted family event. I am waiting for the sheriff, same as you." A teenager near the pond had a little handheld camcorder, one of those new compact ones his parents probably bought at Sears. He was filming Darrell. His friend said, "Man, this is better than cops." The first kid laughed. "This is going on a tape by tonight." That was 1995 for you. Nobody had a phone camera. Nobody could put anything online in 3 seconds. But if somebody got a good embarrassing moment on VHS, that tape could travel from basement to basement faster than gossip in a beauty salon. Darrell heard them, and something in him shifted. He moved closer to me, low enough that the crowd could not hear every word. "Open that gate," he said. "You are making a mistake." I kept the camcorder on him. "No, Daryl. You made the mistake when you printed my pond on your flyer." His jaw tightened. "Do you know what it costs to build a community? Do not people expect from me?" That was the first honest thing he had said all morning. Not because he cared about the people, because he cared about what they expected from him. Later I learned he had been selling Maple Ridge locks with promises of pond access, walking trails, and a shared greenbelt. He had put the pond on sale sketches, talked about it at open houses, even told buyers that the property was going to be transferred to the association once a few small details were resolved. The small detail, of course, was that he did not own it, and I had no intention of selling it. Beryl had built his future on a piece of land he could not deliver, and the bus picnic was his last desperate attempt to make it seem real. Maybe he thought if enough people sat by my pond long enough, the lie would somehow turn into a fact. That is the kind of thing men like him believe. They confuse a crowd with permission. By 11 o'clock, the heat had settled over the orchard like a wet blanket. The kids were restless. The ice in the coolers had started to melt. Somebody had tried to set up a grill near one of my apple trees, and I walked over, switched off the propane tank, and told them quietly that fire was not happening on my property. The man holding the tongs said, "Lady, I just came for a hot dog." I told him, "Then you and I have more in common than you think." He looked at me for a second, then nodded, almost embarrassed, and packed the grill back into his truck. It was strange watching people change sides one small moment at a time. A woman apologized to me for letting her kids run across the field. A father asked if my pond was deep. I told him it was deep enough to be dangerous, which was one of the reasons I'd never opened it to crowds. A little girl brought me a plastic worm she had found near the water and asked if it belonged there. I told her, "Yes, honey, it probably lived there before any of us did." She smiled and put it back. Then one of Daryl's loyal friends, a man named Ray Miller, decided the gate was the problem. Ray had the kind of face that always looked like it had just been told bad news about a car repair. He grabbed a picnic bench with two other men and dragged it toward the driveway. I saw what they were planning before they even lifted it. "Do not do that," I said. They ignored me. Ray shouted, "We are not prisoners." "You are not prisoners," I told him, "but you are trespassers, and breaking my gate will not improve your day." He slammed the bench against the steel. The sound rang through the orchard. The gate did not move. Ray hit it again. This time Lou, the bus driver, came storming over. "You hit that gate again," he said, "and I am calling my company and telling them I got hired to transport idiots into a property damage charge." Ray looked at him. Lou did not blink. The bench went down. By noon, the first sheriff's cruiser came up the road, followed by a county vehicle with Donna Wells from planning, and behind them came Deputy Martinez in a second cruiser. The second people saw the lights. The entire orchard changed. Parents started gathering their children. Bus drivers began checking their mirrors. Daryl suddenly became very busy straightening his shirt collar. Sheriff Halverson stepped out of his cruiser slowly, like he had all the time in the world, even though I knew he had probably been racing up that road. He was a tall man with gray hair, mirrored sunglasses, and the kind of calm that can make a loud room feel foolish. He did not look at me first. He looked at the buses, the grills, the banner, the crowd, the pond, and finally Daryl. Then he walked to the gate and said, "Morning, May." "Morning, Sheriff. Everybody all right? Nobody's been hurt?" He nodded, then turned to Daryl. "Mr. Price, I have one question before we discuss anything else. Why are you and all these people on Mrs. Pline's land?" Daryl lifted his chin. "Sheriff, this is community property. There is a dispute over the legal status of the tract." Halverson looked at him for a long second. "That was not my question." Daryl opened his portfolio again. He produced a copy of one of those marketing maps, a handwritten note about a drainage easement, and a letter from the HOA board authorizing the Heritage Day event. The sheriff looked at the papers, then handed them to Donna Wells. She read them, glanced at me, and shook her head. "This is not a deed," she said. "This is not a permit. This map is not a county map. And this easement is 10 feet along the roadway, not 12 acres of orchard and pond." Daryl's face changed color. Sheriff Halverson held out his hand toward me. "May, you got your paperwork?" "I did." I walked back to the porch, brought out the cardboard box, and handed him the deed, the survey, the tax documents, the correspondence from the county. and the original title papers Eli had kept in a manila envelope for almost 3 decades. Sheriff Halvorsen looked through every page. He did not rush. That was the part Daryl hated most, I think. He wanted a quick argument, a loud argument, an argument he could twist. But paper has a way of slowing men down. Finally, the sheriff closed the folder and looked at Daryl. This land belongs to Mrs. Klein. It is not in your association. It is not a public park. It is not a community greenbelt. You brought several hundred people onto private property without permission. Daryl tried to speak. Halvorsen raised one hand. I am not finished. If you charged residents money for this event under false claims, that may become a separate matter. You are lucky nobody got hurt around that pond. A woman in the crowd shouted, "We paid $20 per family." Then another voice said, "He charged us for bus transportation." A third voice said, "He told us the HOA owned the place." Daryl spun toward them. "People, please, you are misunderstanding the legal process." Walter Green called out, "No, Daryl, we misunderstood you. The sheriff ordered the buses loaded one at a time. He told me to unlock the gate when each bus was ready to leave, and I did. I was never trying to keep anyone there. I wanted order, witnesses, and a record of what happened. One by one, families packed up folding chairs, cooler lids slammed shut, kids climbed back onto the buses tired and confused, and the yellow buses rolled out through my gate in a slow line. Some passengers stared at Daryl through the windows. Some shook their heads. One older woman leaned out and yelled, "You owe me $20 and an apology." I have to admit, I smiled at that, not because I enjoyed her humiliation, exactly, but because Daryl had spent months treating people like furniture in a room he owned, and now every one of them had started standing up. When the last bus pulled away, Daryl was still inside the gate. The banner had fallen into the grass. The pond was quiet again. There were paper cups near the shore, crushed napkins in the orchard, and one inflatable raft tied to an apple tree like it had lost its way. Daryl stood there holding his portfolio, but it looked less like a symbol of power now and more like a lunchbox somebody had forgotten to pick up. He looked at me and said, "You think you won something today." I looked at him for a moment because part of me wanted to say every sharp thing I'd ever kept behind my teeth. I wanted to tell him he had insulted my husband, my home, my age, my grief, and my intelligence. I wanted to tell him that a pond was not just water and a field was not just empty space waiting for a developer to name it something, but what came out was quieter. "You did not lose this land today, Daryl. You never had it." Sheriff Halvorsen nodded toward the road. "Time to go." Daryl walked out through the gate without another word. I watched his Buick disappear down the county road, and when the dust settled, I stood there beside the same steel gate he had expected to walk through like a king. Part 3. What stayed behind? I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. It would make a cleaner story, the kind people tell at church suppers, where the bad man gets embarrassed, the sheriff shows up, and everybody goes home wiser. But life is usually messier than that, especially when pride gets involved. 3 days later, I got a certified letter from a law office in Harrisburg. Daryl was accusing me of unlawful detention, emotional distress, financial damages, and interference with community activities. The letter demanded I apologize publicly and pay reimbursement for the failed event. I read it once, then read it again, then carried it out to the kitchen trash and laughed so hard I had to sit down. Roscoe looked at me like I had finally lost my mind. I called a lawyer in town named Helen Vargas. Helen was small, sharp, and had a habit of tapping her pencil against the desk whenever somebody said something foolish. I brought her my file box, the VHS tape, the flyer, the survey, the sheriff's incident report, and every letter Daryl had ever sent me. She watched the tape with her arms crossed. At one point, Daryl appeared on screen holding his bullhorn and saying, "This is our lake now." Helen paused the tape, looked at me, and said, "May, this man has done half my job for me." Daryl went on local television the following week. It was one of those Sunday morning public affairs programs nobody watched unless they were sick or waiting for the football game. He sat in a studio with a fake potted plant behind him and said he had been trying to create unity in a divided community. He said I had used fear to isolate innocent families. He said I had trapped people in dangerous heat. The station showed a clip of Sheriff Halvorsen saying there had been an open pedestrian exit and that nobody had been prevented from leaving on foot. Then they showed the county survey map. Daryl looked like a man trying to swim while wearing a suit made of bricks. The story spread the old-fashioned way. It went through the diner, the hardware store, the church parking lot, the bowling alley, and every kitchen table within 20 miles. By the end of the month, people were calling it the Maple Ridge Picnic Disaster. The Brecon Hollow Gazette ran a photo of the buses lined up inside my gate with the headline, HOA event held on private land. Somebody dropped a copy in Daryl's mailbox with the word, "Oops," written across it in black marker. I did not do that. I would like that noted. But the real damage did not come from newspapers or gossip. It came from inside Maple Ridge. A woman named Clara Benton came to see me one evening. She had been the HOA treasurer, a quiet woman with silver hair and tired eyes. She stood on my porch holding a brown grocery bag. I invited her in, made coffee, and she sat at my kitchen table for nearly 10 minutes before saying a word. Finally, she pushed the bag toward me. Inside were photocopies of checks, handwritten notes, meeting minutes, and bank records. Daryl had used HOA reserve money to rent the buses, print the flyers, and pay for food. He had also used association money to make deposits on property improvements around my pond, including a contractor who had quoted him for picnic shelters and a fishing dock. He had been spending money on land he did not own, telling board members the deal was already in motion, and telling residents that I had agreed to cooperate. Clara looked at me and said, "I believed him for longer than I should have. I am sorry." I remember looking at her hands. They were shaking. I told her, "You came here. That matters." She began to cry, not loudly, just the tired kind of crying people do when they realize the thing they defended was not what they thought it was. There was one more item in that bag, an old cassette tape. Clara said it was from an HOA meeting in June. Daryl had forgotten a recorder was still running after everyone left. Helen transferred it to a larger tape in her office, and when we listened to it, we heard Daryl speaking to another board member. He said, "May will fold once she sees enough people on the property. Nobody wants to be the old widow who keeps children from a pond." Hearing my name in his voice made something in me go very still. That was his plan all along. Not to negotiate, not to buy, not to make a fair offer. He wanted to turn the town against me, make me look selfish, make me feel ashamed for holding on to what was mine. He had not expected me to have paperwork, cameras, friends, or a sheriff who knew the difference between a property line and a sales pitch. The case against him grew quickly after that. Maple Ridge residents demanded a special meeting. Daryl tried to hold it in the clubhouse, but so many people came they had to move it to the high school gym. I did not want to go. I had spent months avoiding that side of the road. But Helen told me I should be there, not to make a speech, not to humiliate anyone, just to be present. So I went. I sat in the back row beside Walter Green and Clara Benton. Daryl stood at the front of the gym under buzzing fluorescent lights, wearing a suit this time, trying to look like a man in control. But every time somebody asked him a question, another layer came off. Why did you tell us the pond belonged to the HOA? Why were buses paid for from reserve funds? Why did you promise park access during home sales? Why did you call Mrs. Klein selfish when you never had permission to use her land? He answered with long sentences that did not answer anything. He blamed miscommunication. He blamed legal confusion. He blamed the county. He blamed me. At one point, he looks directly across the gym and said, "Mrs. Klein has made this personal." I stood up before I could talk myself out of it. My knees were shaking, but my voice was not. "Daryl," I said, "you made it personal when you decided my husband dying meant my land was easier to take." The room went quiet. Even the kids in the bleachers stopped whispering. I did not have anything else prepared. I did not need to. I sat back down. A week later, Daryl was removed as HOA president. The association hired an outside auditor. The county opened an investigation into the misuse of funds. Helen filed for an injunction to keep Daryl and the HOA off my property, and the court granted it. The judge's order was simple: no entry, no events, no claims of ownership, no interference with the use of my land. I copied that order and placed it in a weatherproof frame beside the gate, not because I wanted to show off, but because sometimes peace needs a sign people can read from the road. Daryl did not disappear overnight. Men like him rarely do. He sent letters for a while. He had a private investigator take photographs from the county road. One evening I found orange survey paint on a fence post and called Sheriff Halverson. Another time a pickup truck sat across the road for 2 hours with 2 men inside watching my house through binoculars. But every time I documented it. Every time I called the sheriff, every time I put another paper in the box beneath my kitchen table. And then, slowly, the noise began to fade. The lawsuits went nowhere. The auditor's report came out. Maple Ridge residents found out just how much money Darryl had spent trying to create a lake community around a pond he did not own. His real estate business dried up. His house went up for sale the following spring. I saw the sign from my driveway one afternoon, white and red in front of that big brick house he had been so proud of. I did not celebrate. I did not dance on the porch. I just looked at it for a while and thought about how much energy a person can waste trying to control things that were never theirs. The surprising part came later. It was early October, cool enough for sweaters, and the orchard was heavy with apples. One Saturday, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox from a family that had been on one of the buses. The mother wrote that she was sorry for believing Darryl. She said her daughter, the little girl with the fishing pole, still talked about my pond and asked whether the ducks were okay. At the bottom, she wrote, "We should have known better than to follow someone just because he sounded certain." I read that note 3 times. A few days later, I called her. I told her I was planning to pick apples that weekend, and as she wanted to bring her daughter by for an hour, she could. Not for a public event, not for an HOA picnic, not for a brochure. Just one family, one afternoon, with my permission. They came with a small basket and a bag of homemade cookies. The little girl fed apples to Roscoe, who was old enough by then to accept snacks from anybody. She stood beside the pond and watched the ducks. Then she looked at me and said, "Mrs. Gann, Klein, is this your lake?" I looked down at the water, at the trees reflected in it, at the old gate standing open behind us because I had chosen to open it. "It is my pond," I said, "but it is also their home before it is anybody else's." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Over the next year, things changed in a way I had not expected. Maple Ridge rewrote its rules. They elected a new board. They stopped pretending every piece of open ground around them belonged to the community. A few families from the subdivision became neighbors in the real sense of the word. They waved when they drove past. They brought over soup when I had the flu. One summer evening, I invited a small group of children to help pick apples, and their parents stayed by the gate until I told them it was all right to come in. That may not sound like much, but after what happened, it meant everything. Respect does not always arrive with a grand speech. Sometimes it comes in the form of somebody waiting at a gate until you say yes. These days, when I look back on that morning in 1995, I do not remember Darryl's bullhorn as clearly as I remember the sound of the gate closing. I remember the buses, the heat, the paper cups blowing across the grass, the way the pond looked after everyone left, still and grey under the late afternoon sky. I remember feeling scared, not because I thought Darryl would win, but because I knew that once somebody decides your boundary is inconvenient, they will try to make you feel cruel for having one. That is the trick. They call you selfish when you say no. They call you difficult when you ask for proof. They call you the problem when you refuse to hand over something they have already decided should belong to them. But I learned something that summer. You do not have to scream to stand your ground. You do not have to become mean just because someone else has become pushy. You can keep your paperwork, lock your gate, call the sheriff, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. Still, I will ask you this because people have argued about it for years. Was I right to close that gate after the buses came in, even with the pedestrian exit left open and the sheriff already on his way? Should I have opened it immediately and let Darryl scatter the crowd before anyone had to answer for what happened? Or was that steel gate the only reason the truth finally had nowhere left to hide? Tell me what you think in the comments. I want to know where you draw the line between protecting your peace and becoming part of the fight. And if you have ever dealt with a neighbor, a boss, a family member, or a self-appointed leader who thought your boundaries were theirs to ignore, share your story too, because sometimes the loudest person in the room is not the one with the most power. Sometimes it is the quiet person standing beside a locked gate, holding the deed, and finally saying, "No, not this time."